Her family was gathered around the dinner table on a cold evening in 1994. Plates were set, voices filled the room, and her children waited for their mother to walk through the door. But she never came home. Later that night, her car was discovered on a dirt road outside town, keys still in the ignition. Yet, there was no sign of Deborah. Police searched, and the case went cold. Then, more than a decade later, skeletal remains were uncovered in the woods. Modern DNA technology revealed a male profile, a man who had lived among them all along. But how did he escape suspicion for so long? And what secret did the DNA finally expose about that night when Deborah Lynn Carter vanished? Would expose one of Alabama's most shocking cold cases. July 1994. The day began like any other for 43-year-old Deborah Lynn Carter. She worked at a small office on the edge of town, a place where the rhythm was predictable and the routine rarely broken. Co-workers remembered her as soft-spoken but dependable, the kind of person who never left tasks unfinished. She arrived on time, kept her desk neat, and when she said she would do something, she followed through. That particular evening, a Friday, the air was heavy with Alabama heat. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the trees, and the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Inside the office, fluorescent lights flickered, and the last phones rang before the weekend silence set in. Deborah gathered her things, papers stacked, a pen tucked neatly into her purse, and wished her colleagues a good night. She reminded them she had dinner waiting at home and needed to leave promptly. It was a small detail, but one that would later haunt them. Just after 9 o'clock in the evening, she walked out the front doors. Witnesses said she wore a simple blouse, jeans, and her hair pulled back the way she often did when she had no plans other than heading home. In the lot, she unlocked her sedan, slipped into the driver's seat, and pulled out onto the main road. Nothing about that moment seemed unusual. Yet, it was the last confirmed time anyone saw her alive. The drive from her workplace to her home was not a long one. 15 minutes, maybe less, along a familiar route she had driven hundreds of times before. Streetlights lit portions of the way, but many stretches were dark and lonely, lined with fields and tree lines that swallowed the headlights. For investigators later, this short, ordinary route became a corridor of mystery. Somewhere between her office and her front door, Deborah vanished. When she did not arrive home, her absence was noticed quickly. Deborah's family was already gathered around the dinner table. Plates were set, the food cooling as minutes ticked by. Her children kept glancing toward the door, expecting to hear the sound of her car in the driveway. But the hours stretched on. At first, they thought she was delayed at work. Then, as night deepened and no call came, worry set in. Deborah was not someone who disappeared without explanation. By midnight, her family began making phone calls. Friends had not seen her. Neighbors had not heard from her. Her workplace confirmed she had left just after 9 o'clock in the evening. For her family, dread settled in. They knew something was wrong. The following morning, when she still had not come home, concern turned into alarm. Her brother drove the roads she normally traveled, scanning ditches and fields, hoping for any sign of her car. Nothing. By midday, he filed a missing persons report with the local police department. Officers listened carefully, noting that Deborah's character made her disappearance immediately suspicious. She was not the type to vanish voluntarily, and there were no signs of mental distress or financial troubles. Investigators retraced her last known steps. They confirmed she had clocked out at work. They interviewed co-workers who repeated the same detail. She had said she was going straight home. To them, this was routine, something she did every night, without fail. That evening, less than 24 hours after she was last seen, the official search began. Patrol cars drove the length of her route, red and blue lights flashing in the summer darkness. Officers knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen Deborah's sedan. Volunteers joined in, combing the roadside with flashlights. Yet, in those crucial first hours, there was no trace of her. Chapter 1 ends with that silence. A short drive, a familiar route, a woman who said she was going home to her family, and yet she never arrived. The first tangible break in the search for Deborah Lynn Carter came less than 24 hours after she vanished. On the evening of July 16, 1994, a patrol officer following her usual route noticed something unusual just off a gravel turnoff. Parked at an odd angle near the tree line was a dark sedan that matched the description of Deborah's vehicle. At first glance, the scene could have been mistaken for a car pulled over by someone too tired to drive, or perhaps suffering mechanical trouble. But as the officer approached, details immediately raised alarms. The driver's side door was unlocked. Inside, sitting on the passenger seat, was Deborah's purse. On the dashboard, her keys were still resting in the ignition, as if she had only just stepped out. Yet there was no Deborah. The car sat half hidden in tall grass, the front bumper angled slightly toward the woods. There were no skid marks on the road, no signs of a crash or sudden stop. The tires were not flat. Nothing suggested an accident. Instead, the scene looked frozen, interrupted mid-journey, abandoned in haste. When investigators arrived, they secured the area with yellow tape and began documenting every detail. Photographs captured the car's position, the surrounding brush, and the contents inside. Nothing appeared stolen. Her purse still held her wallet, identification, and a small amount of cash. There were no broken windows, no bloodstains, and no immediate signs of struggle. To many, it felt eerie, as if she had simply stepped out and vanished into the night. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who had joined the search gathered near the roadside, whispering in disbelief. Some prayed silently. Others wondered aloud if she had been forced from the car, or if she had willingly left it for reasons no one could yet explain. Police expanded their search outward from the vehicle. Canine units were brought in to pick up Deborah's scent. The dogs circled the car, noses to the ground, tails tense. For a brief stretch they pulled toward the woods, but the trail faded only a few hundred feet in, leaving handlers frustrated. It was as though Deborah's presence had been erased. Detectives canvassed the area, questioning anyone who might have passed through that night. One truck driver reported seeing a set of headlights pulled to the side of the road around the same time Deborah disappeared, but he could not confirm the make or color of the vehicle. A woman living a mile away told officers she thought she heard a short, sharp cry in the dark that same evening, but assumed it was a fox or coyote. Despite the leads, nothing concrete emerged. The location of the car only deepened the mystery. Why would Deborah stop there, along a deserted stretch of road she rarely used? The dirt track led only to scattered farmland and forested parcels. She had no known connections in the area. To investigators, it suggested one of two possibilities. Either she was forced off the road, or she pulled over for someone she knew. As the days passed, the car became a haunting symbol. It was towed to the police impound lot, but the image of it sitting unlocked in the grass remained burned into the minds of the searchers. Deborah's family found little comfort in the discovery. To them, the vehicle without her inside was worse than nothing. It confirmed she had begun the drive home, but it gave no answers as to why she had not finished it. The abandoned car raised more questions than it solved. It offered no fingerprints beyond Deborah's own, no foreign fibers, no signs of forced entry. Investigators described it as too clean, a scene that revealed absence rather than presence. For the community, the discovery changed the tone of the case. It was no longer just a missing person late returning home. The unlocked car, with keys in the ignition, pointed toward something far darker, a sudden interruption, an encounter that ended without warning. And while the car marked the first major clue, it also marked the moment fear began to spread through the town. If Deborah could vanish so suddenly, in a place so familiar, Then what exactly had happened on that dirt road in July 1994? The discovery of Deborah Lynn Carter's abandoned car shifted the case into high alert. By the time the vehicle was confirmed as hers, it was clear this was no ordinary disappearance. The Opelika Police Department quickly organized its first large-scale search. It began with the immediate area around the dirt road. Officers and deputies walked shoulder to shoulder through the tall grass, flashlights cutting through the darkness, scanning for any sign that Deborah had stepped out of her car. They looked for footprints, pieces of clothing, disturbed earth, anything that could show where she went or where she was taken. The following morning, the search expanded. Volunteers from the community arrived with gloves, water bottles, and determination. They formed lines through nearby fields, calling Deborah's name as they moved. Farmers opened their pastures. Landowners unlocked gates to wooded parcels. The search stretched mile after mile, yet the results were the same: silence. Canine units worked tirelessly. Starting at the car, dogs followed faint traces of Deborah's scent. For a brief moment, they pulled handlers toward the tree line, their tails stiff, noses low to the ground. Searchers froze, holding their breath as the dogs whined and circled. But just as quickly, the trail went cold. The scent disappeared as though Deborah had been lifted from the earth itself. Officers considered whether another vehicle had been involved. If she had been forced from her car and placed into someone else's, it would explain why the scent ended so abruptly. But there were no tire tracks distinct enough to confirm it. Rainfall earlier that week had softened the dirt road, but not enough to preserve impressions. What little could be seen blended into the ruts of farm trucks and passing traffic. Neighbors living within a few miles of the site were interviewed. One woman told police she thought she heard a sharp cry the night Deborah vanished, brief, startled, and quickly silenced. Another resident recalled seeing headlights veer off the highway around the same time, but could not be certain it was her car. Each account added fragments to the puzzle, but none formed a clear picture. As the hours stretched into days, the search grew exhausting. Volunteers waded through creeks, climbed fences, and pushed through dense underbrush. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning fields with infrared cameras, but nothing surfaced. Every object raised hopes: a scrap of fabric, an old shoe, a plastic bag, but each time investigators confirmed it was not Deborah's. Her family joined the search, walking alongside strangers who refused to give up. Her brother was seen standing near the taped-off area where the car had been found, staring into the woods as though willing them to give back what they had taken. For him, each passing day without answers felt heavier, more unbearable. The search lasted more than a week before resources began to thin. Officers returned to their regular shifts, volunteers went back to work, and the road where Deborah's car had been discovered grew quiet again. The only reminder of the effort was the trampled grass along the ditches, flattened by dozens of desperate footsteps. When the first search officially ended, investigators had nothing concrete to show for it. No body, no evidence of foul play, no personal belongings beyond what was left in the car. The file grew thicker with interview transcripts and search maps, but not a single piece of physical proof explained what had happened. The silence left behind was perhaps the most haunting detail of all. For her family, the first search brought no relief, only the realization that Deborah's absence was deeper, darker, and more permanent than they had feared. The dirt road where her car was found would remain a scar on the landscape, a place that symbolized unanswered questions. And as investigators packed up their equipment and volunteers returned home, the chilling truth settled in. If Deborah had been taken, she was now far beyond the reach of their voices. When the first search produced nothing, no body, no clothing, no tracks, the investigation shifted focus. If the landscape held no answers, perhaps the people closest to Deborah did. Detectives began with her co-workers. They remembered her as punctual, careful, and never one to stir conflict. The night she disappeared, she had signed out at 9:03 in the evening, a detail logged in company records. Several colleagues confirmed they saw her leave with her purse over her shoulder, heading straight for her car. Nothing seemed unusual. She was not upset, she was not rushed, and she had not mentioned meeting anyone. One coworker described her mood as tired but normal, the way she always was after a long shift. Next came her family. Interviews with her children, siblings, and parents painted the same portrait. Deborah was responsible, grounded, and had no reason to vanish willingly. There were no signs of financial trouble, no hidden debts, no sudden plans to leave town. Her family insisted she was deeply tied to her children's routines. If she ever needed a break, she would have told us, her brother said. She would not just walk out. Investigators then turned to her personal life. One name surfaced repeatedly: her former boyfriend, a man she had dated off and on in the early 1990s. The relationship had ended months earlier, and while friends said it had not been violent, there had been arguments. Detectives brought him in for questioning. He admitted their relationship had been rocky at times, but denied any involvement in her disappearance. He claimed he had been out of town on the night in question, staying with relatives. Police confirmed parts of his alibi, but gaps remained. Without physical evidence linking him to the scene, they could not move forward. Neighbors were also interviewed. Living in a small Alabama town meant everyone knew one another's habits. One neighbor recalled hearing a car engine late that night, but could not say whether it was Deborah's. Another insisted Deborah once complained about a man who made her uncomfortable, though she had not given a name. Police followed up on the lead, but no clear suspect emerged. Attention briefly shifted to a mechanic who lived near the dirt road where the car was found. He had a history of alcohol-related arrests and was rumored to have a bad temper. For weeks, speculation swirled in the community that he might be involved. Detectives searched his home, examined his work schedule, and interviewed his colleagues. Nothing tied him to Deborah. His alibi, unlike others, checked out clean. He had been working a late shift and signed time cards backed his story. By the end of the summer, investigators had interviewed dozens of people. They traced her steps from the office to the dirt road, but no one could fill in the missing gap. Tips came in, each promising to break the case open. Sightings of her car on back roads, claims she had been seen in neighboring counties, but none held up. Each time officers followed a lead, it crumbled. The case file grew thicker, but not stronger. Without evidence, the interviews amounted to little more than speculation. Everyone had theories, one retired investigator later said. But theories do not hold up in court. We needed facts. By autumn, frustration set in. The press had run stories in the early weeks, highlighting the abandoned car and the fruitless search, but coverage slowed as other news took over. Inside the police department, the tone shifted from urgency to resignation. Deborah's case, like so many others, began to slip toward the back of the pile. For her family, each collapsed lead was devastating. Every time the phone rang, they hoped it would bring news, only to hear that another suspect had been cleared. The unanswered question, what happened to Deborah on that short drive home, remained as open as the night she disappeared. And so, by the close of 1994, investigators faced the reality that every path they had followed led nowhere. Deborah's car was the only tangible evidence, and beyond that, the trail was cold. By the end of 1994, the investigation into the disappearance of Deborah Lynn Carter had reached a dead end. What began with urgency and long hours of searching had slowly turned into a file that investigators found themselves opening less and less often. The case file itself told the story. Inside were maps marked with circles showing where volunteers had searched, logs of interviews with co-workers, neighbors, and family, and photographs of her abandoned car. But beyond those pieces, there was little else. No eyewitnesses placing Deborah with anyone suspicious that night. No surveillance cameras along her route. This was 1994, before small-town roads were monitored. And most crucially, no body. Without it, police could not even prove a crime had occurred. Detectives met weekly in the months after her disappearance, reviewing tips and debating next steps. At first, every meeting carried urgency. By November, the tone had shifted. The same evidence was being shuffled across the table, the same questions repeated without new answers. One officer later admitted that it felt like chasing smoke. Public interest faded just as quickly. Local newspapers that had once carried Deborah's photograph on the front page moved on to other stories. Flyers posted around town weathered and tore, becoming unreadable under the Alabama sun and rain. The community, shaken at first, began to settle back into routine, though unease lingered. Deborah's name was spoken less in public spaces, but in private, families locked their doors earlier at night. For her family, however, nothing returned to normal. Every holiday was marked by her absence. At Thanksgiving, her chair at the table sat empty. At Christmas, her children opened presents without their mother. Her parents, aged visibly in those months, weighed down by the not knowing. Her brother gave interviews, pleading for information, but responses dwindled as time passed. Police kept the case technically open, but by early 1995, it was no longer active. Officers moved to newer cases that demanded their attention: burglaries, assaults, even other missing persons. Deborah's file was left in a drawer, labeled but gathering dust. Cold cases have a way of slipping into the background like that, not because investigators do not care, but because without leads, there is little they can do. Rumors circulated in town, as they often do in unsolved cases. Some believed Deborah had been taken by someone passing through, a stranger who would never be caught. Others whispered about people closer to her life, men she had dated, neighbors she had argued with. None of it could be proven, and so speculation filled the void where facts were absent. Occasionally, a new tip would come in. A caller claimed to have seen a woman who looked like Deborah in another state. Someone else swore they remembered seeing a suspicious truck near the dirt road the night she disappeared. Investigators followed each one, but every lead collapsed under scrutiny. False hope, one detective called it. By the year's end, the conclusion was unavoidable. The trail had gone cold. Without a witness, without evidence, and without a body, the case had nowhere to go. What remained was a haunting absence, a car with keys in the ignition, a family left in limbo, and a town that no longer felt as safe as it once had. For her family, this was the cruelest part: not knowing if Deborah was alive or dead, not knowing if she had suffered, not knowing why. Each day, without answers, deepened the wound, and as the months turned into years, the silence around her disappearance grew heavier. The official term for it was a cold case, but for those who loved her, it was something far worse, an open wound that time refused to close. When the police closed the active investigation and placed Deborah Lynn Carter's case into the growing file of unsolved disappearances, the responsibility of keeping her memory alive shifted almost entirely to her family. For them, the word cold did not exist. The case was not a file, it was their sister, their daughter, their mother. In the months following her disappearance, her brother Daniel became the most visible voice. He spent his evenings stapling flyers to telephone poles, gas station boards, and grocery store windows. Each flyer carried the same photograph: Deborah smiling, hair pinned back, with bold black letters underneath, missing. A phone number at the bottom offered the promise of contact, a chance that someone, somewhere, might know something. Her children, still young, struggled with the silence adults gave them. They asked questions no one could answer. When is Mom coming home? Why did she leave her car? Their grandparents tried to soften the blow, saying only that the police were looking and that everyone in town was helping. But as weeks turned to months, even the children sensed the truth that answers were not coming. The family held vigils outside their home. Neighbors brought candles, standing shoulder to shoulder, whispering prayers into the night air. Local pastors spoke of faith, of justice, of not losing hope. At first, the vigils drew crowds. Dozens came to show support, but over time, attendance thinned. People grew tired. Other concerns replaced the urgency that once filled the town. For the Carter family, though, the vigils never stopped. Even if only a handful attended, they lit candles every July to mark the day she went missing. Inside the home, Deborah's absence was impossible to escape. Her room remained untouched, the bed neatly made, curtains drawn. Her coffee mug still sat on a shelf, unwashed from the last morning she used it. These small details, ordinary and meaningless in daily life, became sacred to her family, frozen reminders of the last moments before everything changed. Holidays were the hardest. At Thanksgiving, her family set out an extra plate, refusing to let her be erased. At Christmas, her children opened gifts with forced smiles, the joy of the season dulled by the emptiness of not having their mother present. Her father, who rarely spoke of emotions, was often seen sitting quietly at the table, staring at the empty chair. Every phone call carried both dread and hope. Each time the phone rang, her family rushed to answer, praying it might be a detective with news. Instead, the calls were routine. Telemarketers, friends checking in, wrong numbers. The phone became both a lifeline and a source of torment. Deborah's mother grew frail under the weight of uncertainty. She often sat near the front window, watching cars pass on the street, hoping against all logic that Deborah might appear in one of them. When asked why she spent so many hours there, she answered softly, "Because if she comes back, I want to be the first to see her." Her brother described the years after 1994 as a slow erosion of hope. At first, he believed every flyer, every prayer vigil, every interview would bring answers. But as months stretched into years, he admitted the hardest part was not grief. It was the not knowing. If she is gone, I need to know she is gone. If she is alive, I need to know where. Living in between is unbearable. The family's fight to keep Deborah's name alive became an act of resistance against the silence. They refused to let her fade into the background, even as the world moved on. For them, the waiting was not passive. It was active, painful, and relentless. Flyers, vigils, interviews, repeated over and over, year after year. Yet, despite all their efforts, the phone call they prayed for never came. And so, the Carter family lived in suspended time. Each day a reminder that Deborah was missing, and each night a reminder that no one had been held accountable. The world called it a cold case. For them, it was an open wound. From 1995 onward, Deborah Lynn Carter's disappearance slowly slipped from the public eye. In those early months after she vanished, her name had been spoken daily, in church sermons, in the grocery store, on the front pages of the Opelika newspaper. But by the time a year had passed, the story had all but disappeared from headlines. For investigators, the case was technically still open, but in practice it was stalled. Detectives admitted privately that they had run out of leads. Every promising tip had collapsed, every suspect cleared. The file sat in a drawer, marked and catalogued, waiting for something new to revive it. The years stretched on. By the late 1990s, the Carter family realized that if answers were going to come, they would have to keep pressure on the case themselves. Daniel Carter, Deborah's brother, gave occasional interviews to local radio and newspapers, reminding the public of her name. He often carried a stack of old flyers in his truck, posting them in places where people might still notice. The image of his sister, her careful smile, her hair pulled back, became a ghostly presence on worn and faded paper. For Deborah's children, the silence was even more painful. They grew up without their mother's voice, their milestones marked not by her presence but by her absence. Birthdays, graduations, even everyday routines became reminders of what was missing. Teachers at their schools noticed the weight they carried, an invisible burden that set them apart from other children. By the early 2000s, new crimes occupied the attention of police and the press. Deborah's name was rarely mentioned in town meetings anymore. If the case came up, it was often followed by a shrug. That was years ago. Inside the Carter household, however, the wound remained open. Her father, who had once been a steady and stoic figure, grew quieter with each passing year. He often sat in his chair by the window, watching cars pass, as if expecting one to stop and deliver his daughter home. Her mother carried the grief differently, more visibly. She prayed aloud every night, asking God for a sign. But with every year that passed, her prayers were met with silence. From 1995 to 2007, there were occasional flares of hope, a call to the police station about a possible sighting, a tip from someone who claimed to know something. Each one was logged, investigated, and dismissed. The community grew weary of false alarms. For the Carter family, every collapse of hope was another knife twist. By 2007, 13 years after her disappearance, Deborah's case had become what investigators call buried cold. It was not that anyone had forgotten her entirely. Her family and a few dedicated officers still carried her memory, but in official terms, the case was dormant. Without new evidence, there was no reason for detectives to pull the file from storage. The silence was suffocating. Deborah's children were adults by then, but the questions of their childhood had never been answered. Where did she go? Why did she leave her car behind? And most of all, who was responsible? When anniversaries came, the family held small vigils. The gatherings that once drew dozens now brought only a handful of relatives and close friends. Candles were lit, prayers whispered, and then life went on. The town itself seemed to have moved forward, but the Carter family remained frozen in July of 1994, unable to cross a threshold that never should have existed. In those 12 long years, from 1995 to 2007, the case was not just buried in the files of the police department, it was buried in the collective memory of a town that had grown tired of waiting. But the Carter family never stopped waiting, and though they could not have known it, the silence would not last forever. A discovery was coming, one that would reopen everything. In March of 2008, nearly 14 years after Deborah Lynn Carter vanished, a hunter was walking along the banks of the Black Warrior River. He had taken the same trail many times before, a narrow path that wound through thick brush and led into a clearing. That afternoon, the air was cool, the trees still bare from winter, but what he noticed on the ground stopped him cold. Half buried beneath a tangle of leaves and roots, something pale caught the light. At first, he thought it was the remains of an animal, but as he drew closer, he saw the curve of a human skull. The hunter froze. The silence of the woods pressed in around him. Then, gathering himself, he pulled out his phone and called the local sheriff's office. Within an hour, the area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and investigators in gloves and protective suits were combing through the site. What they found was grim. Scattered across a shallow depression in the soil were skeletal remains, bones weathered by time, clothing reduced to fragments. Tattered fabric clung to ribs and hips. Nearby, partially hidden by moss, was a small necklace. The chain was rusted, but the pendant was still intact. Detectives immediately thought of Deborah. The site was roughly 20 miles from where her car had been found in 1994. The necklace matched the description of one she was known to wear. The remains were carefully collected and sealed in evidence bags. Each bone was numbered, photographed, and lifted from the soil. Forensic teams worked methodically, treating the ground as a crime scene frozen in time. Soil samples were taken, insect activity recorded, and every object, down to the smallest scrap of cloth, was tagged. The discovery made headlines within hours. For a community that had gone more than a decade without answers, the story of human remains found near the Black Warrior River brought Deborah's case rushing back into public memory. Local television replayed images of the wooded site, showing investigators moving slowly among the trees. For her family, the news was almost unbearable. After years of waiting, the possibility that Deborah had finally been found was both a relief and a fresh wound. Her brother Daniel admitted later that he felt torn in half. "We had prayed for answers for so long," he said, "but when the call finally came, I did not know if I could handle the truth." The remains were transported to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. There, forensic anthropologists laid the bones out on a table, examining them for trauma. They searched for signs of fractures, bullet wounds, or knife marks. Clothing remnants were analyzed to see if they matched what Deborah had been wearing the night she disappeared. The necklace, carefully cleaned and restored, was photographed and compared with family photos that showed Deborah wearing it. Dental records provided the confirmation. Teeth recovered from the skull were matched against Deborah's old dental charts. The alignment, fillings, and enamel patterns were a perfect match. 14 years after she disappeared, the Carter family finally had an answer. The remains were Deborah's. The announcement shook the town. For years, her absence had become an uncomfortable silence, a ghost in the background of community life. Now, that silence was broken. The case was no longer about a missing woman. It was officially a homicide. For investigators, the discovery was both a breakthrough and a burden. They finally had Deborah's remains, but with them came new questions. How had her body ended up miles from where her car was found? How long had she been there before the hunter stumbled upon her? And, most importantly, who had left her in the woods, and why? The Black Warrior River site, once just another stretch of quiet forest, became sacred ground in the investigation. It was the place where Deborah's story, long buried, began to speak again. When the skeletal remains found near the Black Warrior River were brought into the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, investigators knew the stakes. 14 years of unanswered questions hinged on what they could uncover in the lab. The bones were first cataloged by forensic anthropologists, laid out on long stainless steel tables. Each fragment was cleaned, photographed, and recorded. The skull was examined for distinctive features, the teeth for dental markers, the pelvis for age and sex indicators. From the beginning, investigators suspected the remains belonged to Deborah Lynn Carter. The location, the necklace, the clothing fragments, they all pointed in her direction. But suspicion was not enough. The family deserved certainty. The process began with dental comparison. Forensic dentists requested Deborah's records from her family dentist, who still had her charts and X-rays stored on microfilm. They examined the teeth recovered from the skull, carefully preserved despite years in the ground, and compared them against the records. The shape of the molars, the pattern of fillings, the spacing between the incisors, they aligned perfectly. Forensic scientists declared a positive match. Still, investigators wanted to strengthen the case with DNA. Small bone samples were sent to a specialized laboratory. In 2008, DNA testing was far more advanced than it had been in 1994. Analysts extracted mitochondrial DNA, comparing it against samples provided by Deborah's mother and siblings. The results confirmed what the dental evidence already suggested. The remains were, without question, those of Deborah Lynn Carter. For her family, the confirmation was a bittersweet blow. On one hand, they finally had an answer. For 14 years, they had lived in a purgatory of uncertainty, never knowing if Deborah might still walk through the door. The confirmation ended that painful ambiguity. But at the same time, it closed the door on hope. She was gone. There would be no reunion, no miraculous return. The reality of her death settled in with crushing weight. When investigators visited the Carter home to deliver the news, the moment was heavy with silence. Daniel Carter, her brother, later described the officer's words as a punch to the chest. Deborah's mother cried quietly, clutching a photo of her daughter. Her father, who had grown frailer over the years, said very little, staring into space with a kind of stunned resignation. News of the confirmation spread quickly through the community. For many, it was the end of speculation. The missing person posters, the whispered theories, the occasional rumors of sightings in other states, all of it collapsed into the single, undeniable truth. Deborah had been murdered, and her body left to decompose in the woods not far from home. The announcement reignited media attention. Local news stations covered the story extensively, showing the wooded recovery site, replaying footage of the original search in 1994, and interviewing townspeople who still remembered the case. "It is good the family finally has answers," one woman said, "but it is also terrifying to think someone could do this and get away with it for so long." For law enforcement, the confirmation was only the beginning of a new phase. What had once been treated as a missing person file was now officially a homicide investigation. Detectives began revisiting evidence from 1994 with fresh eyes, pulling items out of storage, re-examining them with technology that had not existed when Deborah disappeared. The confirmation of the remains gave the Carter family the closure of knowing, but it also reopened every wound. Funerals could be planned, prayers could be spoken, but justice was still absent. Someone had killed Deborah, and that person was still free. For the investigators, the confirmation was not the end of the story, it was the turning point. They finally knew for certain whose bones lay near the Black Warrior River. Now, they needed to find out who had put them there. When the remains near the Black Warrior River were officially confirmed as belonging to Deborah Lynn Carter, the case was no longer classified as a missing persons investigation. It became a homicide. That single change altered everything. For law enforcement, the discovery reawakened a file that had sat dormant for more than a decade. Boxes of evidence, sealed and stored in a climate-controlled room, were pulled from shelves. Detectives, who had long since moved on to other assignments, were called back in to brief the new team. Forensic scientists, equipped with tools that had not existed in 1994, were asked to examine every scrap of evidence collected the night her car was found. At the Opelika Police Department, the tone shifted. What once felt like a hopeless case was now treated with renewed urgency. A body meant proof of a crime. Proof of a crime meant someone could, eventually, be held accountable. The first step was to inventory everything. Investigators spread the contents of the evidence boxes across long tables, photographs of Deborah's car, transcripts of interviews with co-workers and neighbors, items collected from the vehicle itself, fabric fibers, hair strands, even soil scraped from the floorboards. In 1994, none of it had yielded useful results, but in 2008, DNA technology had advanced dramatically. Every item that could possibly hold trace evidence was re-examined. Analysts tested clothing fragments, hair samples, and even the rusted necklace found with her remains. Each test was meticulous, designed to recover the tiniest fragments of DNA. The most promising evidence came from Deborah's clothing. A careful analysis revealed faint biological material, degraded from years of storage but still intact enough to produce a profile. It was male DNA. For the first time in 14 years, investigators had a potential lead. The discovery electrified the case. Detectives knew that DNA was as close to a fingerprint as modern science could provide. But when they entered the profile into CODIS, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's national DNA database, they were met with silence. No match. Whoever had killed Deborah had never left his DNA in the system before. No arrests, no prior convictions that required sampling. It was like chasing a shadow. Still, the very existence of the DNA meant the case was no longer without direction. Forensic experts advised detectives to preserve the profile carefully. New technologies were emerging every year, and what CODIS could not identify today might be solvable tomorrow. Meanwhile, investigators revisited the human side of the case. They re-interviewed Deborah's family, asking again about her routines, her relationships, her habits in the days leading up to her disappearance. They spoke once more with her ex-boyfriend, her neighbors, her co-workers. Old inconsistencies were re-examined, though most of the same answers were repeated. Detectives also broadened the scope, consulting with state investigators who specialized in cold cases. They reviewed similar crimes across Alabama in the 1990s, hoping to find patterns. Was Deborah's case an isolated act, or part of something larger? Nothing definitive emerged, but the exercise underscored one truth: her murder had been carefully hidden. For the Carter family, the reopening of the investigation was bittersweet. They were grateful that police were once again working the case, but they also knew it meant reliving their trauma. Each interview dragged them back to 1994, to the unanswered questions they had carried for years. Still, they cooperated fully. "If this is what it takes to find out who did this," Daniel Carter said, "then we will go through it again and again." By the end of 2008, Deborah's case was firmly back in motion. The discovery of her remains had given investigators a body, and modern forensic testing had given them a profile. It was not enough to name a suspect yet, but it was the strongest lead the case had ever had. The file, once dusty and forgotten, now carried a new label in bold red ink: Homicide Active. When investigators reopened Deborah Lynn Carter's case in 2008, the hope was simple: that modern forensic science might succeed where 1990s technology had failed. Evidence collected in 1994 had been carefully stored, bagged, labeled, and sealed in climate-controlled rooms. At the time, it seemed routine procedure. 14 years later, it became the foundation of a breakthrough. Among the preserved items were pieces of Deborah's clothing, carefully lifted from her abandoned car and from the recovery site where her remains were found. In the 1990s, these items had been inspected visually, swabbed for fluids, and tested with rudimentary methods. Nothing useful had been detected. But forensic science had advanced dramatically since then. Even degraded material, microscopic traces invisible to the naked eye, could now yield DNA profiles. Analysts at the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences began the painstaking process of retesting. Wearing masks and gloves to prevent contamination, they worked with tweezers and precision tools, isolating tiny fragments of fabric. Under specialized lighting, they identified faint discolorations, too subtle to have been noticed in 1994. These areas were cut into samples and subjected to advanced DNA extraction methods. The results were conclusive. Male DNA was present on the fabric. The finding electrified the investigation. For more than a decade, detectives had been operating in a vacuum. They had theories, they had suspicions, but no proof. Now they had something tangible: genetic material that could have come only from direct contact with Deborah on or near the night she disappeared. The DNA profile was developed and entered into CODIS, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's national database. Investigators held their breath, hoping for a direct hit. A match would mean an immediate suspect, an arrest, perhaps even a confession. But when the system processed the data, the screen delivered a single, devastating word: no match. The disappointment was heavy, but detectives understood the meaning behind it. Whoever had left that DNA was not in CODIS. He had never been arrested for a serious felony. He had no prior convictions requiring a sample. In essence, he was a ghost in the system. Still, the discovery represented a turning point. For the first time, the case was tethered to science rather than speculation. Detectives knew they had something irrefutable, DNA does not lie. It does not forget. It does not fade away with time the way memories and alibis do. Investigators began to think differently about the case. They considered whether Deborah might have known her killer, someone close enough to approach her car without raising suspicion. The lack of struggle inside the vehicle suggested she had not been surprised when she stopped. The DNA evidence seemed to support the theory that her abductor had been in close contact with her, perhaps even someone she trusted. In press briefings, detectives revealed only fragments of what they had found. They announced that new forensic testing had yielded promising results, but kept the details quiet. Publicly, they wanted to avoid spooking a potential suspect who might still be living in the community. Privately, they knew this was the strongest lead the case had ever produced. For the Carter family, the revelation of DNA evidence brought a mix of hope and dread. On one hand, it was proof that investigators were closer than ever to finding the person responsible. On the other, it underscored the horrifying truth. Someone had been there with Deborah the night she vanished. Someone whose presence was now etched into the fibers of her clothing, preserved across time. Though CODIS had delivered no match, forensic experts encouraged detectives not to give up. Advances in genetic genealogy were beginning to make headlines. Even unidentified DNA could, through family connections, point to a suspect. The science was still young, but the possibilities were growing. The discovery of male DNA did not solve the case, but it cracked open a door that had been sealed shut for 14 years. For the first time, investigators could say with certainty, someone's genetic fingerprint was tied to Deborah's murder. It was only a matter of time before science, persistence, and patience would connect that fingerprint to a name. By the late 2010s, Deborah Lynn Carter's case had been cold for more than 2 decades. The male DNA profile developed from her clothing in 2008 had remained unmatched in CODIS. For years it sat in a database, waiting, but no hit ever came. Then a new tool began to make headlines across the country: forensic genealogy. It was a method that had already solved previously impossible cases, including the Golden State Killer in California. The technique worked by comparing unknown DNA to profiles submitted by ordinary people who had mailed saliva samples to commercial ancestry companies, hoping to learn more about their heritage. These consumer databases were not designed for criminal investigations, but with cooperation from some companies, law enforcement could use them to search for relatives of an unknown suspect. From there, genealogists could build family trees that eventually pointed to a likely individual. In 2019, investigators in Alabama decided to try it with Deborah's case. They sent the preserved DNA profile to a lab specializing in forensic genealogy. Weeks later, the first results arrived. Not a direct match, but distant relatives, second and third cousins, scattered across the southeastern United States. The genealogists began their painstaking work. They mapped out branches of the family tree, using public records, birth and death certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries. Each document added a new branch, narrowing down the possible connections. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Several of the DNA relatives traced back to a single family line with deep roots in Alabama. Detectives watched as names filled whiteboards and charts. Some branches were eliminated quickly, relatives who were too young, too old, or female. Others remained possibilities. The tree began to narrow to a handful of men who would have been the right age and who had lived within reach of Deborah in 1994. The process was slow, meticulous, and at times frustrating. Genealogists had to account for adoptions, name changes, and incomplete records. Every time they thought they had reached the end, a new branch appeared, forcing them to double back. But persistence paid off. By early 2020, the investigation had zeroed in on a family with several brothers and cousins, all of whom had grown up within a few miles of Deborah's home. Among them, one man stood out: John Michael Harris. He had been 27 years old in 1994, lived less than 3 blocks from Deborah at the time of her disappearance, and had quietly remained in the area ever since. To detectives, Harris fit a chilling profile. He had no serious criminal record, explaining why his DNA was never in CODIS. He had worked steady jobs, married, and raised children, presenting himself as a normal member of the community. Neighbors described him as quiet, even forgettable. He was the kind of man who drew no suspicion, precisely because nothing about him seemed unusual. The genealogical evidence was not enough to arrest him outright. It pointed investigators in his direction, but did not prove he was the one who left DNA on Deborah's clothing. To close the gap, detectives needed a direct sample from Harris himself. And so the next phase began: covert surveillance. Officers tracked his routines, where he shopped, where he worked, what he threw away. They waited for the moment when he might discard something carrying his DNA: a coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a piece of silverware. The family tree had led them here, to a man who had lived in plain sight for nearly 30 years. But only science could confirm what genealogy suggested. Once genealogical research pointed to John Michael Harris, detectives knew they were close, but not close enough. Family trees and probabilities were not enough to hold up in court. What they needed was irrefutable proof: a fresh DNA sample directly from Harris that matched the male profile preserved on Deborah Lynn Carter's clothing since 1994. The problem was that Harris was not about to walk into a station and hand over his DNA. Investigators would have to obtain it another way: quietly, legally, and without alerting him. The solution was surveillance. A small team was assigned to watch Harris around the clock. They followed him discreetly, using unmarked vehicles, rotating shifts, and maintaining just enough distance to avoid raising suspicion. They documented his daily routine with meticulous detail: when he left his house, where he worked, the routes he drove, the stores he visited, even the times he stopped for coffee. What they needed was simple but specific, something Harris would discard that carried his genetic material: a cigarette butt, a plastic cup, a straw, anything that could legally be collected and tested against the profile recovered from Deborah's clothing. For weeks, investigators trailed him. Some nights were uneventful. Harris drove home from work, stayed inside, and gave them nothing. Other days offered opportunities. He stopped for fast food, tossing wrappers and straws into bins. He drank from coffee cups in parking lots, flicked ash from cigarettes out the window. Each time, detectives pounced after he left, carefully bagging the items and logging them into evidence. The first samples were promising: 2 cigarette butts collected outside a hardware store. Forensic scientists worked quickly, extracting DNA. The tension was high as they ran the comparison against the profile from 1994, but the results were inconclusive. The samples were degraded, possibly contaminated, and could not be confirmed as a definitive match. Detectives did not give up. They knew the window of opportunity was narrow. If Harris suspected he was being watched, he might change his behavior. Worse, he might try to destroy evidence. So the surveillance continued, day after day, until finally a break came. One afternoon, Harris stopped at a convenience store. He purchased a bottle of soda, drank it in his truck, and tossed the empty plastic bottle into a trash can by the gas pumps. Within minutes of his departure, detectives retrieved it, gloved hands placing it into an evidence bag. This time, the DNA sample was strong. When the lab results came back, the mood inside the police department shifted instantly. The DNA from the soda bottle matched the unknown male profile recovered from Deborah's clothing. After nearly 30 years, investigators had the proof they needed. Harris was the man who had been with Deborah the night she disappeared. The confirmation electrified the team, but it also demanded caution. An arrest would only stick if the chain of evidence was airtight. Detectives double-checked every procedure, ensuring the collection was legal, the surveillance logs complete, the lab reports beyond dispute. They knew defense attorneys would scrutinize every step. For Harris, life appeared to continue normally. He went to work, came home, attended family events, completely unaware that the net was closing in. To neighbors, he was still the quiet man down the street. But to detectives watching from a distance, he was a suspect whose long-hidden secret had finally surfaced. The surveillance operation underscored a chilling truth. For decades, Harris had walked freely among the very people who had prayed for Deborah's return. He had attended the same church services, stood in the same grocery store aisles, perhaps even nodded politely to members of her grieving family, all while knowing what he had done. Now, with DNA evidence in hand, detectives prepared for the next step. The surveillance phase was over. The time for arrest was near. In February of 2023, nearly 29 years after the disappearance of Deborah Lynn Carter, detectives arrived at a quiet suburban street just outside Opelika. The modest, single-story house where John Michael Harris lived looked like any other in the neighborhood. A trimmed yard, a weathered porch swing, 2 cars in the driveway. On the surface, it was ordinary. But on that morning, it became the center of one of Alabama's most stunning cold case arrests. The decision to move in came after weeks of preparation. The DNA match had given investigators certainty, but prosecutors wanted the arrest to be airtight. Warrants were drafted, reviewed, and signed. The case file was thick, pages of genealogy charts, lab reports, surveillance logs, and chain of custody documentation for the discarded soda bottle. Everything was ready. At dawn, unmarked vehicles rolled quietly into the neighborhood. Officers wearing vests and plain clothes stepped onto Harris's lawn. Some carried rifles. Others moved toward the back of the house to block any possible exit. The lead detective, the same one who had delivered the DNA match to Deborah's family, stood at the front door. At 6:14 in the morning, he knocked. Harris answered, wearing a t-shirt and jeans, clearly just awake. His expression shifted from confusion to shock as the officers identified themselves. When he was told he was under arrest for the 1994 murder of Deborah Lynn Carter, neighbors later said his knees seemed to buckle slightly. He did not resist. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists as officers led him down the porch steps. Across the street, blinds lifted and doors cracked open as neighbors emerged, drawn by the flashing lights of squad cars now parked at the curb. Some whispered in disbelief. Others stood frozen, struggling to reconcile the man they had waved to for years with the accusation now made public. He lived here all this time. One neighbor told reporters later. He was just normal. Cut his grass, drove his kids to school. I never would have guessed. For investigators, the arrest was both triumphant and sobering. They had finally taken Deborah's suspected killer into custody, but the moment carried a weight far beyond routine procedure. It was the culmination of nearly 3 decades of work, frustration, and waiting. Officers who had been rookies back in 1994 stood on the scene that morning, watching Harris placed into a squad car. Some admitted privately they felt emotional, even shaken. Inside the house, officers executed a search warrant. They collected personal items, computers, and documents, looking for anything that might connect Harris further to Deborah's murder or reveal other potential crimes. Detectives were careful, knowing defense attorneys would challenge every piece of evidence. As Harris was driven away, Deborah's family received the call they had waited for since that summer night in 1994. Daniel Carter described the moment as surreal. "I always imagined what it would feel like, hearing they had him," he said. "But when the phone rang, I just sat there. I did not know whether to cry, scream, or pray." News of the arrest spread rapidly. Local television crews descended on the neighborhood, broadcasting live shots of the modest house where Harris had lived freely for decades. Headlines read, "Cold Case Cracked After 29 Years," and "DNA Links Local Man to 1994 Murder." Comment sections and social media feeds filled with stunned reactions. For the community, it was a reckoning. For years, they had spoken of Deborah's case in hushed tones, as a tragic mystery with no resolution. Now, they learned the man accused of killing her had been their neighbor, sitting beside them at church, shopping in the same stores, and walking the same sidewalks. That morning, Harris's life of anonymity ended. The mask of ordinariness he had worn for nearly 3 decades was stripped away by science, persistence, and time. For nearly 3 decades, the Carter family had lived with a question mark where an answer should have been. They woke each morning knowing Deborah Lynn Carter was gone, but not knowing how, why, or by whom. The arrest of John Michael Harris in 2023 finally replaced that question mark with a name. Yet, for the family, the truth came wrapped in both relief and heartbreak. When detectives delivered the news, the Carters wept openly. Relief coursed through them. Relief that their loved one's disappearance was no longer a mystery. Relief that their years of waiting had not been in vain. Relief that Deborah's story would not be forgotten as just another cold case. But woven into that relief was pain just as sharp. They were reminded, with brutal finality, that Deborah was never coming home. Her brother Daniel expressed the paradox plainly. "We got what we wanted, but it does not heal what we lost." The community, too, felt the weight of the resolution. For years, Deborah's case had been the town's unanswered tragedy, a wound that festered in silence. The revelation that Harris, someone who had lived quietly among them, was accused of her murder stunned neighbors. Some felt betrayed. Others admitted they had long given up hope that the case would ever be solved. Now, justice had arrived, but in a way that forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, about appearances, and about evil hiding in plain sight. Court proceedings brought further validation. In hearings, prosecutors presented the mountain of evidence: the DNA preserved from 1994, the genealogy that led investigators to Harris, the discarded soda bottle that confirmed the match. Each detail built a case too strong to ignore. Defense attorneys challenged the methods, but the science stood firm. The profile was clear. The chain of custody was clean. The probability of error was non-existent. For the Carter family, attending court was agonizing. They listened as forensic experts described the testing of Deborah's remains, as detectives recounted the surveillance of Harris, as genealogists explained the family tree that had pointed investigators directly to him. Every detail, though necessary, reopened wounds they had spent years trying to close, but through it all they remained present. They wanted Deborah's story told, not as a case number, but as a human life stolen too soon. When Harris was finally convicted, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of the judge's voice. For Deborah's family, that moment carried a weight words could barely capture. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They sat in stillness, tears running freely, as if finally exhaling after holding their breath for nearly 30 years. Outside the courthouse, Daniel spoke briefly to reporters. His message was simple: "We never gave up, and we want other families to know, do not give up. Justice can take time, but it can come." The conviction did not erase the pain. It did not restore the decades Deborah missed, her children's graduations, their weddings, the grandchildren she never held. But it gave her family something they had been denied for so long: certainty. They could lay her memory to rest with the knowledge that the man responsible was no longer free. In the end, the Carter family described their feelings as a balance of two truths. Justice had been served, yes, but justice was not the same as wholeness. Deborah was gone. No verdict could change that. And yet, When they gathered for the first vigil after the trial, lighting candles in her honor, there was a different energy in the air. The questions that had haunted them for decades were no longer unanswered. The case that had once been cold was finally closed. For Deborah's family, it was not closure, but it was justice. And sometimes, in cases like this, justice is the closest thing to peace that the living can find. Nearly 3 decades of silence, and finally the truth spoke through science. For Deborah Lynn Carter's family, justice came not with joy, but with the heavy relief of finally knowing. One man had lived quietly in plain sight, carrying a secret that haunted a town and devastated a family. Cold cases remind us of something chilling. Time does not erase the truth. It only waits for the moment when evidence, persistence, and technology bring it to light. But as this chapter closes, the question lingers. How many more families are still waiting for their answers? How many killers are still walking free, hiding in plain sight, just like Harris once did? Thank you for watching. If you want to follow more cases where silence finally breaks and hidden truths are uncovered, subscribe and stay with us. Because every unsolved case is more than a story, it is a life, a family, and a fight for justice that never ends.